In this lesson, we'll continue our investigation into the mentalizing system of the human brain. We've learned that there are a set of brain regions that seem to be activated when individuals are thinking about the mental states of other people. And the right temporoparietal junction is one of these key areas. Sachs and her colleagues argue that this area is selectively activated when we're thinking about the thoughts of other people. It's present in all typically developing individuals. So cross-cultural studies have found it in people from all kinds of different cultures, and its activity is correlated to behavioral measures. So 4-year-olds who can pass the false belief task tend to have greater activity in this region than 4-year-olds who cannot pass the false belief task, as though activity here is enabling the 4-year-old to better process the mental states of other individuals. In addition, when individuals are watching these social animations, those geometric figures moving around in seemingly intentional ways, greater activity here in this region is correlated to the use of more mentalistic terms. The right TPJ is selective for others' thoughts in adults, argues Sachs. But interestingly, during development, say from age 5 to 12, there is a change in the selectivity of the region. So 5-year-olds show activity in TPJ for not only mental states of people, but also just physical facts about the people or their personalities or personal histories. In other words, TPJ is less selective for the younger individuals. As development progresses, the selectivity increases over time, so that in adults, TPJ seems to respond only to stimuli that involve the thoughts of other people. In this lesson, we'll ask the question, do blind people process mental states in the same way as sighted people? Now, what motivates this kind of question? Well, you'll recall that the superior temporal sulcus has that face area here that's processing the dynamic aspects of faces like emotional expression and eye gaze. And we said that is a source of input to the mentalizing region. And that makes sense because we can use facial cues to make inferences about mental states. But in blind individuals, blind from birth, that whole visual processing pathway, that whole set of inputs will be absent. So it raises a question. Will blind individuals, given this altered set of inputs, will they have a functional mentalizing system? And if they do, then how does it get established? Are the theory of mind regions genetically programmed? So in other words, will they function properly in spite of altered inputs in the blind brain? Or do the theory of mind regions require certain kinds of functioning inputs at key stages of development, like visual inputs and language inputs? So in this lesson, we'll consider the blind brain and what it can tell us about important brain systems like the mentalizing system, and we'll ask a specific question: does the right temporoparietal junction require visual inputs to develop normally? And again, we'll be looking at the work of Rebecca Sachs and her colleagues. Before we go on, let's take a look at just a refresher of the surface of the brain. And here we see the back of the brain. The occipital cortex is the visual system. Why is it a visual system? Because it's receiving inputs that ultimately originate from the eyes. So light is transformed into electrical signals in the eyes, and specifically the retina. Those electrical signals travel down nerve fibers and eventually make their way up to the back of the brain. So the reason this area is processing visual information is because it's hooked up to the eyes. Likewise, the region that this part of temporal cortex is processing auditory information is because it's hooked up to the ears. So ears are going to transform pressure waves into electrical signals. They will make their way up to auditory cortex. And the same with the skin. Skin has receptors that respond to pressure and temperature, etc. They will send electrical signals up to parietal cortex here, the touch cortex. All of these sensory systems run through a region of the brain called the thalamus. There are 2 of them deep in the brain, and we'll just, for now, indicate that sensory information is running through the thalamus on its way up to the cortex. So for blind individuals, blind from birth, for example, down here we see cataracts. Many individuals are born with severe cataracts, and that really just blocks out any prospect of seeing. So they're just not going to be having rich visual information reaching the visual cortex due to the blockage caused by the cataract. So again, the question is for us, if the mentalizing regions here are getting visual inputs as one of their major sources of inputs, what's happening in the blind brain? if their visual cortex is not processing visual information, then they can't possibly be sending visual inputs into the mentalizing system. What's going to happen? Will blind individuals have these mentalizing regions? And if they do, how are they getting established? Do language systems provide needed inputs? So in other words, perhaps language systems are sufficient to allow this part of the brain to do its mentalizing task. Rebecca Sachs and her colleagues then simply put blind people in the fMRI machines and compared brain activity with sighted people. Now, for these theory of mind tasks for blind people, of course they can't read, so they had to present the stories in an auditory fashion. So they would hear stories that either involved people having certain beliefs, right, so the thoughts of people, or they would hear stories about physical things happening. Just as we've seen in the past for sighted individuals, when you contrast stories with beliefs with stories with physical happenings, you get activity in the right TPJ. So this area of the brain is responding to the idea that somebody's having a mental state, some other person is having a thought, and this right TPJ is responding to that. But take a look for the blind individuals. They too have activity in the very same location, and it's also selective for mental states. So in spite of the fact that blind people have never seen any faces or emotional expressions or anything, evidently that visual deprivation has not altered permanently their mentalizing system. They still show activity in the right TPJ when they are processing the mental states of other people. So while blind individuals show the same location for activity, for mentalizing, and also the same kind of response profile, so it is selective for beliefs, for example, and not just facts about people or something. While this system seems similar to sighted individuals, there were interesting differences between the brains of blind individuals and sighted individuals. And we can see that when you do a different contrast. So instead of doing sort of the belief versus the physical stories, where you get selective activity here in the right TPJ, if you take the fMRI data and just do the blind brain processing the auditory stories and subtract the activity of the sighted people processing the auditory stories, you see greater activity in the blind individuals in the visual cortex. Now think about that a second. They're hearing a whole bunch of stories about people or physical events, but they're hearing these stories and they're showing activity in the visual cortex. These are blind individuals. And the idea is visual cortex is being activated by the language elements of the task. So greater activity for language comprehension in blind individuals in what is normally the visual cortex. So evidently in the blind brain, this area of the brain that is normally processing vision for sighted people is being repurposed to process other kinds of information, in this case, language information. So one interesting thing about the blind brain is that the visual cortex, at least in sighted individuals, is active for non-visual tasks, right? In this case, language comprehension through auditory channels. And this shows that a large cortical region deprived of its normal inputs can reorganize so as to perform other functions. So while blind individuals seem to have similar mentalizing systems, the nature of their blindness is causing a shift, a reorganization of cortical function. Of course, this region of cortex here, without any visual inputs, it doesn't just sit there and do nothing. What seems to be happening is it is getting repurposed. It is involved now in other kinds of cognitive tasks. Now, in a moment, we'll return to the question of, well, how is this mentalizing system in a blind brain getting set up? What other kinds of inputs are then being used to make this system work if it's not getting visual inputs? We'll return to that question in part 2, but here I wanted to take the moment to show you some other experiments done on blind brains. And before we get to that, we have to introduce a new technique. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. And you'll notice it involves this wand here, and you can hold it right up to somebody's skull. And what this wand does is generate a concentrated magnetic pulse. Now you'll remember that the brain cells are electrically excitable, and whenever you change a magnetic field, you can induce an electrical current. And so what this wand can do is send a little magnetic pulse across the skull and into a localized brain region and alter the electrical activity of the nearby brain region. Now you can use it to stimulate an area, but more often it's used to interfere with processing happening in a local region. So TMS, to figure out whether a brain region is doing something, what you can do is then use TMS to interfere with that brain region to see if it interferes with the behavior that you're studying. So with that said, you can imagine that you could use TMS then on the blind brain to see what would happen if you interfere with the visual cortex. So let's take a look at a simple study. So done with blind individuals who can read Braille. Now you'll recall that Braille is this system for reading for the blind that involves little bumps on paper here. So the person takes their finger, so it's a tactile task, takes their finger and runs their finger across these bumps. And they've learned that certain patterns of bumps correspond to certain letters, and letters make up words and word sentences. So they learn to read by translating the pattern of bumps into words and sentences. So in this study then, what they're going to do is have subjects touch the little bumps here as they're reading Braille, but they're going to use TMS to interfere with different parts of the brain while they're trying to read Braille. So let's take a look at this region up here. This is somatosensory cortex. And what they would do is take the TMS wand and place it over the finger portion of the brain here. So that part of the brain that is processing sensory information from the finger. And if they time that TMS pulse, that magnetic pulse, just right, they can interfere with the detection of the bumps. So if you do that pulse 20 to 30 milliseconds after touching the stimulus here, you can interfere with the detection of the little bumps. The person will say they weren't able to accurately detect those bumps, as they normally would if they were reading Braille without TMS. So at 20 to 30 milliseconds, you can interfere with the detection of the bumps. Now, if you wait until 50 or 60 milliseconds to do your stimulation, well, then you've given this brain region enough time that the subjects will report, yes, they detected the bumps. So the processing already happened, and then you come along, well, you're too late to disrupt that process. However, if 60 milliseconds after they touch the Braille, you stimulate down here in what is normally the visual cortex, again, this is a blind brain, 60 milliseconds after touching the Braille, so their finger touches here, well, then you can interfere not with the detection, but with the identification of the letter. So they say that they detected the bumps, but that they can't identify the letter. It's as if after touching the bumps, this part of the brain up here, sensory cortex, is registering the tactile stimulation, the bumps themselves. But this area down here that's normally visual cortex in sighted people, but in blind people, this area of the brain seems to be processing the identity of those bumps. In other words, the pattern of bumps that correspond to certain letters. And TMS at that time, at 60 milliseconds here, is interfering with the identification process. So again, it suggests a major reorganization in the blind brain. This area of the brain is not processing vision, but is now involved in the tactile experience of Braille, and in particular, a language function here of translating patterns of bumps into letters, words, and sentences. In addition, in other studies, if you just take the TMS wand and zap the visual cortex back here, it can cause tactile sensations on the fingertips, which kind of fits with the previous study we just mentioned here. So remember, these are blind brains, and this is visual cortex for sighted people, but not for blind people. This area of the brain seems somehow hooked up to the tactile system as well. In addition, if you do TMS here, it can interfere with other kinds of language tasks, and we've seen this in the previous fMRI study when subjects are listening to sentences and so on. TMS to the visual cortex can interfere with language processing through the auditory channels. So again, this area of the brain seems to now be responsive through tactile pathways and auditory pathways. Not so in sighted people, but it is responsive in blind people. In addition, individuals who've learned Braille, blind individuals who know Braille, if they have a stroke in this area, that has been known to cause the loss of the ability to read Braille. Again, this all suggests that there's a major reorganization of this bit of the brain here. It is responsive to tactile stimulation, auditory stimulation, and involved in language processing and other cognitive tasks that it does not seem to be doing in sighted people.